And as many of you are aware, it's got to develop a set of sensibilities through which it recognizes that you in the room are the people who will create jobs, not in fact government. The government does not create jobs, but it's new business that creates jobs, particularly after a recession. It's always been the case, always been the case. By the way, I know Larry Summers very well. I'm just waiting things to settle down to go talk with him. He's too smart a man not to know that. Too smart a man not to know that. So I have hope. I'm an optimist. That's the context from my perspective. On the work of the last couple of years, Norm mentioned the reengineering work that Mike Hammer and I did in the late 1980s, actually early 1990s, and that reengineering book that actually still sells, and I think, in fact, is more important today than when we wrote it. You know, those were a set of ideas about how businesses had to change, about how businesses had to move from what we have described as the stovepipe organization, businesses that were structured around function and around department. And we argued in the early 90s that business had to rethink structure, rethink how work is performed, and look at work not from a functional or from a departmental perspective, but from a process perspective. That was the fundamental reengineering idea. And we had to look at work from a process perspective with the objective of dramatically improving the performance of an enterprise. Those were the fundamental ideas behind reengineering. And you know, in those days, we didn't have a technology infrastructure like we have today. There was no internet. And in fact, there wasn't the enabling technology to allow work and process change to occur the way it can occur today. I get a lot of questions from business reporters who will say to me, isn't the age of reengineering over? I think the age of reengineering is just beginning. The age of fundamental process and work design and redesign is just beginning because we have now an infrastructure to allow change that we've never had before. I think we've only done in most ongoing enterprises somewhere between 10 to 25% of the work redesign change that we'll do in the next 10 to 25 years. And I actually believe this is a long-term cycle of 10 to 25 years of dramatic change in the way work will be performed. Now, a few years ago, I started also to step back and think about, you know, the longer term, and would reengineering be enough? And again, reengineering and those ideas are fundamentally around process. And what I think many businesses and industries need to do is actually go further than that and reconsider the business model, the whole business model, not just how the work is done, but what the nature of product and service is. And when I think about a business model, I think about a combination of what's the nature of the product and service and the value it delivers, and how is it delivered. So it's both about the what and the how. And I wanted to actually do some research and write about new business models. And about that same time, one of the editors of the Financial Times Press, Pearson's publishing arm, came to me and said, look, we'd like to write a series of short business books, very accessible business books. What would you like to write about? And I said, look, I actually believe there's nothing new in management to write about. I believe that. You know, I've been in the consulting business for about 30 years, maybe a bit longer, and the questions that I get asked today about organizations, about change, about structure, about strategy, are the same questions that I got asked 30 years ago. And you know, the answers are the same. The answers are the same. The emphasis may change. But the answers are the same. And again, when I listened to Ram this morning and his advice and his prescription about what to do, about focus, about customers, those are fundamental management principles that have not changed. The emphasis changes in points of time, but the fundamental management principles are the same. Now, you might say, well, how do you write and why do you write all these management books? And they're all out there. You know, I had that discussion with the editor of the Harvard Business Review. I said, look, what keeps you in business? He says, well, you know, we graduate new managers every year and they have to be retaught. It's absolutely true. You know, I no longer make an assumption that a manager understands the fundamental principles of management. So you reteach it. But if you want to learn about management, just go back and read what Peter Drucker wrote in the mid-1900s, in 1950, in his book called Management. And my sense was there's not much to add. But what is changing, I think, is the nature of business, the way business is structured and the way it operates. And so I wanted to go out and I wanted to look at the nature of business and how it was changing. And I wanted to take a different lens in each one of these books. And the first lens in the book called Outsmart, the book that's outside there, really looks at changing business from what you could broadly call a strategy perspective. Where do ideas come from? Where do ideas come from? And how do they get implemented in different ways? And how do they get implemented in unique ways that are actually create some form of competitive advantage in the way either the work is performed or in the very nature of the product and service itself? That's the lens of the first book. And I actually looked at and read about 1,000 companies. And my first filter was companies that were growing at double or triple-digit rates over 2 or 3 years, because I felt that growth at least was an indicator that something different, something new was going on. And then I looked through these companies for the companies that had real, what I thought were really different business models and that were operating in some fundamentally different way. And I write about 10 of them in the first book. By the way, the second book in the series is a book called Inspire, Why Customers Come Back. That'll be out in April. And it really looks at new business models from the perspective of marketing, you could say, and why in fact customers stick, why you're able to hold on to customers, and again looking at a particularly unique group of companies that I think are doing it in an extraordinary way. There'll be a third book called Deliver. It will be an execution book, and I'm doing the research on that now again. What is different in the nature of execution in some of these new business models? So let me just share with you some of the stories, and begin with just some articulation of where ideas in fact come from. And you know, it wasn't a single place by any means. I found the companies that I was looking at finding ideas in multiple places. There were companies that actually saw what others didn't see, entrepreneurs who saw opportunities that others didn't see. There were companies that were breaking the rules of an industry. That was my definition of a bubble, the bubble of an industry that caused an industry to operate in some very rigid way, but provided an opportunity for someone to change the rules. There were some companies that were growing, and these were companies that I would describe as legacy companies that had been around for a while, that were growing dramatically because they were just getting back to fundamentals, but doing it in I think an extremely fine way. There were companies that were finding new opportunities by doing what I call changing their frame of reference. I'll describe to you in a moment what I mean by that. There were some companies that actually were countering the phenomena of outsourcing by insourcing, by doing everything themselves. These were a unique set of companies that had very complex products and very complex services that really chose to maintain all of their operations in-house. There were some companies that were riding a market phenomena, the phenomena of other industries and of other companies. And then there were a very interesting set of companies that were solving consumer and customer problems by dealing with chaos and dealing with complexity. Now, I don't have time to give you an example of every one of these, but let me give you an example of a few of these companies, where the ideas come from, and what I thought was uniquely attractive and interesting about these companies. And don't worry about trying to read these. I just want to give you some visual sense of these companies. These are just copies of web pages that come from some of these companies. This is a company called Sonic Bids. Any of you musicians who play in your garages or in weddings on weekends? This is a service. This is a service for some of those musicians. By the way, there are several million of them out there. And this is a business that was started by a musician who had come to Boston to study at the Berklee College of Music, recognized shortly after he was out of school that, in fact, he wasn't going to be a good enough musician to survive, so he became a talent agent. But he became a talent agent for big acts, for major acts. But because he walked in the marketplace and was in the marketplace, as Ram suggests we have to do, he could see that there were several million performers, musicians, who were not represented. You know, those who play at a wedding, those who play at a club, those who perform occasionally. And so he developed basically a technology-based company in which musicians actually post digitally their portfolio, their performance. People who want these services, whether they be individuals or promoters, subscribe